Hello and good morning, everyone from New York City. We welcome all of our past viewers and all of our new viewers. My name is Sarah Jane Demy, and on behalf of the Demy-Colton team and all of our partners for this exclusive salon, Biotech Gate Digital Partnering, and Big Four Bio, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 43rd installment of the Demy-Colton Virtual Salon Series. As noted above, we always welcome everybody who's returning and everybody who is joining us for the first time, and we hope you keep coming back. Demy-Colton's mission is to convene healthcare industry leaders to catalyze change, and we do this through our in-person events, including BioFuture, our CEO summits, our virtual salon series, such as this today, and coming up in January, Biotech Showcase. Please consider this salon an introduction, if you will, to the impressive speakers and sessions that you will discover when you attend Biotech Showcase, and certainly we hope all of you join us January 8th to 10th. Before we start the salon today, I'd like to introduce Patrick Fry. Patrick is the founder and CEO of Venture Valuation and Biotech Gate Digital Partnering, located in Zurich, Switzerland, who would also like to say a few words. Patrick?
Yeah, welcome everybody to this exciting session that we have ahead of us. I would like to say thank you to Sarah and her team for organizing that. And we've been working now together for a couple of years. Well, we've known each other for many years, but for this Biotech Gate Digital Partnering, we've been working for 2 years, and we really appreciate this collaboration. It's part of Biotech Gate Digital Partnering, as Sarah mentioned. So it's a full week of virtual partnering. We have about 900 participants from about 60 different countries. So there's partnering actually around the clock. If you haven't signed up yet, you can do that. All the participants from the virtual salon get access, a free ticket to participate and try it out. It's also the same software that is being used for BioFuture. That is where we also collaborate with Demy-Colton. So yeah, I'm grateful to be part of that, and I wish everybody a very interesting and exciting panel discussion. Looking forward. It's a very relevant topic, and yeah, heading back to you, Sarah. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Patrick. We're pleased to be partnered with you. Today's topic is extending the runway, a question that has been on the minds of all CEOs in the biotech space for since the pandemic, since the market started to turn. Tactics and strategies to emerge on the other side as a healthier company. So some housekeeping notes before I turn the panel over to the moderator. The salon will start with a 50 to 55-minute discussion, and it will be followed by a Q&A session. Please note that the salon is being recorded, and it will be available for on-demand viewing later on today. It takes us a few hours to get it up there, but it will be available for viewing and reviewing. Now to today's salon. I am pleased to introduce the moderator. Her name is Virginia Amann. She's the founder and CEO of ENTENTE, a communications company. And she will be joined by 4 panelists. We have Gabe Cavazos. He's a senior managing director at Leerink Partners. Marian Nakada. She's a vice president of venture investments at JJDC, Johnson & Johnson. Dennis Purcell, a close friend, founder and CEO and senior advisor at Aisling Capital, and Brad Sitko, chief investment officer at XOMA. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the virtual podium over to Virginia. Virginia, I will return during the Q&A session. Have a good discussion.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the kind introduction. I think this topic is top of mind for everybody right now, extending the runway, tactics and strategies to emerge on the other side of this biotech winter as a healthier company. IPOs are slow. Private financing rounds are taking longer to close. Companies are facing a Series A cliff. It's tougher times right now. I'm really delighted to be here with this panel of experts and industry veterans to talk about this issue and to share what I hope are some real practical insights that you can take away and consider as you navigate these more challenging waters. We've got a number of different goals today. We're going to review some recent market conditions, provide some new insights into some of the challenges of 2022, 2023. We're going to forecast a little bit how things might or might not look in 2024 and what factors could come into play to bring some new life into this industry. We're going to provide some practical insights into how to navigate and ultimately how to survive and thrive in this environment. And we'll be expanding on concepts like prioritizing your R&D programs that, we've heard a lot of that advice in the last few months, and we're going to go a little bit deeper than that today. And we're going to talk about some creative strategies that might be a little bit lesser understood or lesser known. We were on a call just a couple of days ago, and I heard a couple of terms that I wasn't as familiar with. So excited to share a little bit more deeper dive on that. So with that, want to turn it over to my panelists. Give us a little bit, level set for us. Give us a little bit of a hot take, maybe a 1-minute hot take from each of you on how things stack up. Is the market really that bad right now? Is this a perception that's kind of born from the sugar high of 2021? And I'm just going to do my Hollywood squares today. So I'm going to start with Brad.
Thanks, Virginia. I think as we look at the market today, I think we're closer to the end than we were to the beginning of what has felt like a very long biotech winter. Honestly, it's been a slog, but I think we're an incredibly patient and optimistic bunch in biotech. And there's a reality setting in today's market of some of the science that's going to get funded, some of the companies that are going to turn out great on the other end. I'd liken it to we're in the biotech game of musical chairs right now. The music is slowing, but the participants don't quite know how many chairs will be left at the end. But I think the thing that we do know is those that are left at the end, it's going to be an exciting set of games ahead. So we're optimistic for 2024. When in 2024, still not sure. But I think the game and the players might look a little different coming out of this than it did going in.
Thanks, Brad. Thank you. I haven't heard the term musical chairs, but I like that one. Dennis, let me turn it to you.
Sure. I agree with Brad that we're closer to the end than the beginning, but we can't sugarcoat it. The last 2 years have been terrible. Horrible. With the BTK down 70% and the like. But the industry over the last 20 plus years has gone through these booms and busts, and sometimes valuations are higher than where they should be, which we saw in 19 and 20 and the like. And sometimes the science outpaces evaluations. And right now we're in a situation where the science is really moving at a very quick speed, and the valuations haven't caught up yet. So I think we're kind of toward the end. I liken it a little bit to the treasury market. Nobody's talking about 3 more rate increases or whatever. It's now, when is the Fed going to decrease rates? So we're coming toward the end of that, and I suspect we're coming toward the end of this nuclear winter.
Great to hear. Gabe, let me turn it to you.
Sure. I would certainly agree with everything that Brad and Dennis just said. We were probably due for a bear market pullback right around the time when COVID came around, and certainly we saw meaningful capital infused into the sector during those years. So this has been a long time coming. It has been painful. It's certainly one of the more challenging markets I've seen over the last 15 years since I've been at the firm. And I do think we're closer to the end than the beginning. We are seeing companies going away. We're seeing companies being taken private. We're seeing companies really dimming the lights and trying to extend runway any way they can just to survive. And that has been the theme of 23. Certainly, I feel like there are a number of factors that give us optimism for 24. There's been actually meaningful M&A this year. It's a stock pickers market. Certainly, there's a lot of capital on the sidelines waiting to be deployed. But funds have really struggled this year. Most funds are down that are healthcare dedicated. So I think 24 is going to be a certainly a new year certainly would benefit from some rate cuts in Q2. I think that's the general consensus. And obviously that will help our sector significantly.
Thank you. Marian, let me turn it to you.
Yeah, I think that the recovery you might not be able to see because there's a number of companies with a musical chairs analogy that actually are sitting on a chair. And there are companies that are in stealth mode that have been formed over the past maybe 1 or 2 years, you know, well capitalized, well syndicated, perfect valuations, but they're not visible to others. So I think the recovery, at least that is a testament to some of the positive continued activity that you just haven't heard about.
Great. Dennis, I want to turn it to you. You talked a little bit about the history of the space, and you know I've been around in biosciences for 25 years, and you were already a household name then. So I think you've been around maybe the longest out of all of us. Just contextualize this for us a little bit. We've seen previous downturns. You know, how bad did things really get in the past, and are things worse now? We're talking about a little bit of optimism here for the future, but I'd love to hear your historical take.
Yeah, there are some parallels to nuclear winters in the past. I mean, back in 2003 and the like, platforms got out of favor. Venture capitalists went away. There was a spike in restructurings in M&A. The public markets were closed, and it took a long time for the NBI to recover to its past highs. But when we did hit the bottom, the NBI and the XBI exploded actually. So a lot, I think in biotech and a lot of maybe the entire stock market, you could argue is based on sentiment rather than fundamentals. And you know, once the sentiment can change very quickly. Right now, the sentiment is very negative. I saw a survey the other day about the S&P 500, and the only way to make money last year was to be in the Magnificent Seven. And the question was asked of money managers next year in 24, would you, after a tremendous run by these companies, you know, the Apples and the like, Nvidias, would you rather own this Magnificent Seven or the other 493 companies in the S&P? And overwhelmingly, everybody said, I'd rather own the Magnificent Seven. And from a valuation standpoint, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But from a sentiment standpoint, you can kind of guess now where 24 might go. So this is and sentiment, as I said, sentiment can change on a dime. So we'll see. And we saw that in the obesity market with Lilly and Novo, for example, explosion in their stock prices. I think Lilly and Novo now, their combined market caps represent almost 10% of the entire life sciences sector. And that just was the sentiment on the obesity drugs. So when it changes, it can change fast.
Gabe, I saw your mute click off there a second. Did you have something to add?
No, I would agree. I mean, there's certainly therapeutic areas that are struggling. Any of the more capital intensive therapeutic areas, and yeah, I mean, Dennis, to your point, cardiovascular, metabolic. I mean, these were areas 2-3 years ago that were very hard to fund. We saw, you know, very little partnering in M&A, and now we're seeing, you know, companies come out of the woodwork announcing that they're focused on diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So I agree. I think there's great science, great companies under the surface. We're also seeing, you know, this trend in companies now targeting CAR T companies, targeting autoimmune and SLE, right? Where CAR T was very hot 5 years ago, and then it became obviously capital intensive, and companies have struggled, but they've now revitalized their story with a new focus. So I think that is truly a testament of the biotech sector and industry, is that we are resilient and we will pivot when the science dictates.
I'm going to come back to the CAR T conversation in a little bit around the FDA news from yesterday. Are there, you know, historic tactics, approaches, you know, how has the sector classically responded to the need to preserve runway. I know a lot of us have been around for a long time. Brad, you served as an investment banker, but also as a chief financial officer. You've seen this before. Any insights there?
Oh, I've certainly, seen it from all sides of the equation, and, no stranger to the cycles that Dennis was referencing before. I think the reality is companies need to maintain their discipline, as they always should. I mean, I think that's a standard operating procedure for all companies, but spend like it's your money and not an investor's money, and keep an investor friendly mindset in what you're doing. I think there's clear things like pipeline prioritization and limiting spend and burn where they can, relieving costs where possible. I mean, there's painful decisions that companies have had to make in this market, both around, the size of their companies, their colleague sets, et cetera. And I think probably as Gabe and the team are experiencing with companies they're advising, you don't get a medal or a monument for announcing strategic alternatives, right? That meant that everything else wasn't working out for you. So we've seen the companies that have planned ahead, financed creatively, made sure they're well capitalized, are the ones that are set to weather the storm.
And I think getting to the pipeline prioritization, there was a time when being a single asset company was really negative. And I don't think it's necessarily the case now, as long as you have a good asset with sort of near-term data that could drive either BD, hopefully more likely than another financing if that's necessary. But it's but to actually put the platform on ice is not a ridiculous thing to do in this type of market.
Yeah, is that from a communications perspective, and helping companies sort of manage that, and manage announcing that type of news, that they're, focusing a little bit more in the programs. I mean, we've seen mostly, positive reaction to that, I think. So I want to just shift a little bit to some of the operational side of things. How many years right now of runway does a company need to feel safe, as we weather this market? It used to be a year. Is that still the case? I'll throw that out to any of you.
We're advising cash into 26 for both public and private companies. And really, 2 years, 3 years is even better, because it's hard to say how next year is going to play out. Certainly we're not out of the storm yet, and everything's taking longer. We've unfortunately in this environment to where there are a lot of deals being marketed confidentially for public companies right now, and a lot of those deals aren't pricing, they're not announcing. So that means that at any price, investors are not willing to, put money into these companies. So everything's taking longer. It's not clear which data set is going to finally get investors to want to put capital to work. On the private side, I'm advising companies to give themselves a year. What used to be kind of 6-month process from, soup to nuts, give yourself a year, give yourself some cushion. Everything's taking longer. There's no sense of urgency from an investor's perspective. There's no fear of missing out. Everyone knows they're going to get another bite at the apple. So it's everything's just taking longer. You need at least 2 years of runway.
I agree with what Gabe said. I think one of the reasons for that is that the VC community has more. The VC funds have more companies in their portfolio than they've ever had. So there's more that we have to pay attention to, and getting that runway into 25 or 26 means that you have to add to your reserves. So with more companies and more reserves needed, I think that it's becoming harder and harder to invest in new names, just because you got to take care of what's already in the portfolio.
And I think, Virginia, a year had always been kind of a magic number, in part because for accounting purposes and going concern opinions, that was always viewed as a blemish. I think in this environment, it's not only funding to, but funding through critical data and inflection points is really important, because new money coming in is going to want to make sure that there was value created. They're not going to want to create a bridge to nowhere for a company. And as Gabe had highlighted, right, there's a lot, everything's taking longer in this market. Trials are taking longer, recruitment's taking longer, burn is, going up, costs are going up. So making sure you're adequately capitalized through a value creation point is important.
And that value creation point is also oftentimes a BD decision point. So it could be very much that, it would be able to catalyze a BD process. I think the other challenge is what we're saying kind of is a negative for people that are looking for seed funding. So I think when someone knocks on the door and says, oh, we're looking for a $5 million seed, it's not doing what we were just talking about. And so you're seeding to what? And if there's not a Series A term sheet. So I think it's going to be an unintended consequence that we might end up with less innovation to invest in 2 and 3 years, because a lot of companies are not generating that seed data to catalyze a new Series A company.
Marian, when you're evaluating companies, I mean, are CEOs who are coming to you, are they realistic about, assessing their own financial runway? Are you seeing too much optimism? Just curious.
It depends on the level of sophistication and how many scars the CEO has. I think the ones that haven't been through other downturns are not necessarily realistic. So what I mean is they'll come and say, here's, we're going to be filing an IND and we're funding to the IND. And I'm thinking, well, if it's going to take another year to raise the next round, you're missing that part of the raise, because you're thinking the second you flip the data card, you're going to have the Series A wired, and that's not the way it's working. So I think that's one of the reasons. I think another lens for us is, how veteran are these teams, and do they understand and have the resilience to be able to plan, because we don't know what's going to happen next year or the year after. And if you do have that ability to do that, it's a lot less stress for us as investors to know that these folks have tools in the toolbox, and we'll be talking about some of them in the rest of the panel about how to do that.
What other metrics are you looking at? I want to turn to the tools, because I think it's really important to our listener. But are there other metrics when you're evaluating longevity, viability, that you're taking into consideration?
Well, these days for us, we're looking really ideally in our sweet spot as like 12 to 18 months to IND. So we want something where you basically almost have a development candidate, because the concept of being able to fund that, therefore, to that clinical proof of mechanism, which is not necessarily proof of concept, but like early phase 1 data, is something that is much more appealing to us. It's not to say that we wouldn't invest in something earlier, but that's really what we're looking for. And I know I've talked to other VCs that are not strategic VCs, and they're kind of thinking along the same lines.
So we talked a lot about creative strategies, creative approaches for extending runway on our prep call. As I mentioned, I heard some things that I hadn't heard before. So, some new things that are coming out. What are some of these? I would love to dig into not only what these are, but also when people should consider them, how they should consider them. Brad, maybe I'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think alternative financing is more in vogue than ever. I mean, as we've shifted away from an equity-centric market and one where equity and venture debt were readily available to bridge companies through to different inflection points, and companies are being forced to be more creative about what they do, whether it's out-licensing in a non-core geography that won't hamper M&A, for example, or considering things like trial financing or royalty financing is really important. And I think royalty financing has become, more prevalent, certainly over the last 25 years, been more focused on commercial stage opportunities where there was a partnership in place and a drug had been launched. So a way to pull capital forward non-dilutively. There are new strategies like clinical trial financing that are out there, where it's funding specifically around a trial for a specific return, or what XOMA does, where we look at partnered programs that are still generally in clinical phases, and will acquire the milestones or future royalties for the program. So after the upfront has been spent and there's future milestones coming, we can pull that capital forward. And that's becoming increasingly important in this market as one of the tools.
Anybody else? Let me throw it out to the rest of the group. I heard a lot of interesting things a couple of days ago.
Maybe I'll I'll weigh in. I mean, about 18 months ago, when we realized that the markets were slowing down pretty significantly at the board level, if you were a platform company, the mandate was go out and find a partner, right? And monetize your platform, do early stage preclinical deals with pharma, and just generally try to find non-dilutive capital. Since then, it's been, maybe we should think about an ex-US partnership for a lead asset. Maybe we should think about, you know, a pharma partner more broadly, just to de-risk and provide runway. If you're a later stage company, if you have the benefit of being, you know, post proof of concept in phase 2B or beyond, you know, certainly what Brad just mentioned becomes more available, and as you become more clinically de-risked, it certainly becomes more available. And then we're seeing, you know, structured equity financings and kind of everything in between. So it really is this environment to where, you know, most CFOs are doing everything they can to try to bring in capital and extend runway. And those are just you know, kind of the primary ones.
And some of the BD deals are interesting structures where it looks like a giant upfront, but a significant portion of that is probably paying for the R&D of that asset for which the partner has hard rights. And so the R&D is happening on the outside of the pharma, but, you know, there's, you know, either they have a full out license or an option to that asset. So those are other interesting ways to structure BD transactions. And there's also like invest to and sort of invest to onboard, where you can put an equity investment plus some small amount of non-dilutive to be able to secure rights. And that's been done a lot more often in the device space from my experience, because we have device investors at Johnson & Johnson, but in the pharma space, it's possible that an investment can help secure harder rights than it had in before the downturn happened, because it's just a more creative way of using equity plus BD.
Marian, you had mentioned on the public company side, VIPes recently. Can you talk about what those are, how those are?
So I think the concept that a lot of companies went public during the craze, the IPO craze, where they didn't even have, you know, clinical stage, or in some instances, development candidate stage assets. And they are, they continue to, you know, progress the platform and assets with the money they've raised, but their valuations have been like significantly taken a hit, because nobody in the market really understands out there of all these different companies, like what's good and what's bad and what's valuable. They've just kind of taken a lot of these biotech companies that aren't that stage and just assumed that the value is like trading cash or below cash. And so if you are a specialist, meaning especially like a venture investor in the healthcare space, and you know how to pour through those assets, and you understand differentiation, positioning, you know, understand the scientific mechanisms, you can look through those public companies and potentially do investments. In other words, venture. So that's the V part of the I. And so a PIPE is a public investment and a private investment in a public equity, but a VIPE is a venture investment in a public equity. Brad, you or Gabe, you might want to comment a little bit about this more, but I heard, and I wasn't in VC back in 2008, but there were a variety of those types of transactions. And I know that there are a number of venture firms that are sort of shopping in the public space and finding these sort of gems that they could deploy capital to help, you know, rescue them from being cash strapped to develop these assets.
Yeah. So no, this is a trend that we've seen over the last 12 to 18 months. When the markets are, you know, frothy or healthy, productive, deals come together very quickly in the public markets, and venture groups don't have the time to do their diligence or react. They're just not built that way. But now that things have slowed, and frankly, a lot of biotech companies are trading below cash, you know, public companies are forced to do confidentially marketed offerings over the course of weeks to even months. And that creates an environment where VCs really can get under CDA into the data room and do real diligence and work and find venture-like returns, investing in a company that, again, is trading below cash, the pipeline, everything else is effectively free. So we're seeing more of that. You know, right now there are probably dozens of companies out trying to raise capital confidentially.
And what about going private, Gabe?
Yeah. So I wasn't sure if I should bring that up because it is probably a longer conversation, but given, I think there were 74 IPOs in 21, you know, many of those companies did massive crossover rounds. They did massive IPOs. They have hundreds of millions of dollars on the balance sheet. And when the equity story fails, that led to a flurry of reverse merger activity. Now there's a recent trend in some of those public investors and even VCs realizing that why merge with a private company when we can take this company private and buy the company for cash or even below cash, take it private, distribute capital, fund the company through the next value inflection point, to Brad's point earlier, and see whether or not, you know, it works, or shut it down quietly, or do BD. So we are seeing that trend. You know, there are a couple of them publicly that have been announced, and others that are probably coming. And so we're going to continue to see reverse mergers. That's another go public strategy that's very viable. But there's a counterbalance to that in this kind of, you know, go private strategy.
I think as Gabe mentioned in this market, that go private strategy can be code for one of two things. Either there's a valuation disconnect, or it's a subtle way to liquidate a company without going through a bankruptcy. I think we're at an all-time high for biotech bankruptcies as of late. And I think it just emphasizes the disconnect we have today between capital availability and capital need in the market. So it's forced, you know, topical to the discussion today. How do you be creative and extend the runway so that your investors don't get fatigued, or you don't just run out of capital? So that's the pressure on the whole system. If the LP ecosystem is not healthy, then the venture ecosystem, the hedge fund ecosystem, the specialist ecosystem also isn't healthy as well.
Dennis, anything to add here?
No, I just following up on Brad there. I think that we're going through a transformation, and I don't know where it's going to end up. And I think we all have to kind of look at ourselves in the venture world. You know, we were not disciplined in terms of valuations over the last few years, and that causes a huge problem. The IPOs that Gabe talked about in that period, about 90% of them are down from where they priced. So that's been a real kind of disaster. I think boards have to look at themselves. There's over a couple hundred companies trading under cash. You know, how do we let those companies get to that position? I think that the companies themselves are what we're working on. I think it's going through a transformation from kind of oncology and rare diseases to more chronic diseases. I saw a statistic that in 2010, the top 10 drugs treated 50 million Americans, top 10 drugs. In 2020, the top 10 drugs treated 7 million Americans. And so the things we had been working on have been treating fewer and fewer patients. And I think we're going to see some kind of transformation kind of back into more chronic conditions that Gabe was talking about a few minutes ago. So I think from a board level, an investor level, a company level, that we're going to see a kind of a transformation in the sector. Where it all ends up, or where the musical chairs stop, as Brad talked about, who knows? But certainly things are changing, and from my count, well over 100 companies from 21 to 23 don't exist anymore, either through the reverse merger, through bankruptcy or liquidation or whatever. So that number's count and growing by the day. So when we end this, I think the industry is going to look a little bit different than it did over the last few years.
Virginia, one other thing in terms of extending the
And,
runway.
I'm sorry, and I'm sorry, Marian, just one last thing. And I think, although we don't have anybody on the panel here, I think the analyst community has to look at itself too. The analyst community has been way too optimistic about sales potential for some of these drugs. They've been way off in terms of what peak sales might be. And I think that doesn't help the industry either. So I think the analyst community has to take a look at itself. So I think we all have to kind of take a look at what we need to do to make the industry kind of viable going forward, and less of this kind of bull and bear, pull and tug that we've seen over the last 20 years.
Yeah, credibility.
Yeah, Marian.
No, I was about to say we shouldn't neglect grants, for example, in terms of extending the runway non-dilutive. The problem with grants is that they take a long time to get. They can be super onerous for reporting, things like that. But there are companies I've known that have got into the clinic with grant funding. A lot of that can be even more readily accessible in Canadian companies, for example. I've known who have gotten quite far in that. So it's not impossible to use that as a tool also.
I'll just add one last thing to what Brad said. I mean, what's happened in the royalty market is really astounding. How it's become mainstream and clever over the last number of years. And it reminds me way back when we used to use these things called off-balance sheet R&D financings. Genentech did them, Amgen did them, Genzyme did them. And so and there was some tax advantages back then and the like. It would be nice to see those come back also. But I think that we're getting somewhat tired of funding a lot of G&A and overhead and stuff like that. Burn rates still continue to go high. So I'm kind of going back to something Marian said earlier on. Having an asset that is meaningful is fine. You don't need 10 assets right now.
I think it's interesting, Dennis, to your point about like royalty financing just becoming more in vogue, and there's different flavors of it. We touched earlier on clinical trial financing, where someone will fund a phase 3, generally get milestones back upon approval to get a specified return. You have synthetic royalties, which are essentially creating a strip or a stream or a portion of future cash flows or sales of a drug to emulate a royalty that would have been created in an IP-backed license agreement between two parties. You have the traditional royalties. And I think what's put a spotlight on this in today's market, and like the general theme that you're hearing across the panel is, for instance, a company has a $20 million or a $40 million market cap, and they need to raise $20 million bucks. So if they do that, they're selling a third of their company to new investors. And it can be incredibly painful. It's less painful if that same company was raising 20 million on a $100 million market cap, but we've seen that compression in market cap. So raising 20 in a non-dilutive way, whether it's royalty financing or grant money or synthetic royalty, et cetera, can really protect the equity story. And that is, I think, one of the themes that's come out loud and strong in the last couple of years is how do you protect the equity investors from further dilution? I think everyone at least once had said non-dilutive in this panel.
Yeah. So we've had some questions on and some discussion also on venture debt. What's the take on that? Is Dennis, Marian, others? I would love to hear your thoughts.
I mean,
Yeah.
go ahead.
No, go ahead, Marian. No, go.
I mean, I think the concept of using it as a buffer makes sense in terms of taking on debt, obviously with the expectation of paying it back after, let's say, a financing, a BD deal, et cetera. I think the challenge is with financings falling through, like new term sheets are like super hard to get. So many companies are doing these insider-led bridges and with suboptimal amounts that they're raising because they're missing the new money. and potentially with scientific failures. If you take on venture debt with this notion about it being the buffer, you start spending down to the buffer, and you start spending the buffer. It really creates a problem. And so I think, you know, in the day when it worked and you took the money, you paid it back, and you continued on your merry way, that was great. And for a lot of companies, that's not what's happening. And that becomes very, you know, stressful, because then the debt holder really has the ability in some instances to really start calling the shots. And it's almost impossible for new investors or even insiders to fund the company when all they're doing is paying back the debt.
I think in the old days, the venture debt people not only looked at the company, but looked at the investors behind the company and made the decision that, hey, if things go bad, they'll keep funding the company. And therefore our money is money good. And today you can't make that assumption, because the VC community are letting companies go. So that even if you could get venture debt, the terms and the interest rates and stuff like that are just astronomical. So it's a tough one right now.
When I was an operator as a CFO, I inherited a situation where I had venture debt in a private company that was just starting to generate some revenue, and it became the bane of my existence. It was like every 18 to 24 months, you'd try to refinance it out to extend your interest-only runway, right? The thing about debt is it needs to be paid back, right? And so it's when. And it looks great initially, especially when it was with a syndicate of, you know, high quality equity investors. It looks terrible when things go wrong. So I think that, you know, the piece I would advise is it has its place. It has its place in the capital ecosystem. It has a place where it's lowering your overall cost of capital, as does any type of debt. That being said, you need to use it wisely and deploy it smartly, and not just as a substitute
For financing.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's shift gears a little bit. Want to talk a little bit about how companies should balance the need for scale up and growth versus survival right now. Is there any thoughts on that? It's kind of a general question. Would love to hear any thinking that might help our audience think about how to prioritize. Gabe?
I think many of my clients are still in survival mode. They're not really scaling. They're looking to cut costs, reduce burn, trimming where they can. Public companies, if it's clear that the street's not, you know, ascribing any value to your earlier stage assets, deploying capital, you know, continuing to put capital towards those is very challenging. And I've seen, you know, big public companies say we're no longer spending on preclinical development. Right, sending a signal publicly, putting out a press release saying that, hoping that will provide buoyancy to the stock price. So we're very much in this environment to where I think everyone's trying to just reduce burn, and that obviously implies that it's going to be challenging to think about, you know, scaling up and growing. For those that have the I guess good fortune of having a product that's nearing approval, they've got positive phase 3 data, they're in a bit of a pickle, because that's when you would typically be, you know, raising capital, you know, growing a business, building a commercial infrastructure, and that can be very challenging right now, particularly when stock prices are depressed and capital's not as readily available. But even, I mean, that puts more of a priority on partnering, finding pharma partners to de-risk and provide non-dilutive capital.
I'd say also it's an opportunity, depending on what you consider growth, to find assets that are half-baked and from companies that are distressed or, you know, unwinding, and being able to bring those into your company if you have the capital to develop them. So I mean, obviously it's a bit of a needle in a haystack that you'd have to find something that's worth doing, but I've definitely seen some of that kind of shopping going around.
Yeah, the pickle that Gabe talked about, 2/3 of all the public companies are trading at less than $100 million. So to raise any kind of money, you're going to just dilute the heck out of existing shareholders. And so I'm where Gabe is. This is a survival game right now, not a growth game. I like the musical chair analogy.
Fair enough. Sounds good. So I want to switch gears a little bit as well, just so that we're not just looking at the US. What about Europe? What's happening there? Anything that companies in Europe should be thinking about differently than companies in the US right now in terms of this landscape, how they might think about operating? Gabe, I know you spend a lot of time in Europe. Maybe you can address this one.
Yeah, I for the past 10 plus years, I've spent about a third of my time covering European biotech companies. And I do think that the European, I'm generalizing, so Europe and UK biopharma ecosystem has never been stronger. They've got more VCs with billion-dollar funds, private equity-backed VCs, and there's great companies coming out of academia and great operators that have had exits. So that environment, that ecosystem's never been stronger. I think they also benefit from having just lower costs in general. So they don't have to pay their employees as much, their scientists as much. They don't have the exorbitant real estate costs as some of our colleagues in Cambridge and Palo Alto do. So I think they've fared a little bit better on the margin than some of their US peers. And there's also a certain level of kind of regional loyalty that you'll get out of France and Germany and the UK, where you have certain investors where their mission is to continue to foster growth in these areas. I don't think we really have that here in the US. So for those reasons, I do think that you still see a lot of US investors going to look for value in Europe, and capital flowing that way across the pond.
And a lot of innovation coming from all kinds of institutes and universities.
Great. So Marian, you all have a very global perspective at Johnson & Johnson. You are, it's a buyer's market, getting an opportunity to see a lot of really great science, exciting things that are happening. What are you excited about moving forward? What lights you up? I'm sure you're looking for a strong strategic fit with some of the J&J's therapeutic areas, but talk to us a little bit more about what you're excited about. And I'd love to hear from the rest of the group as well.
I think we're interested in mechanisms that are novel and transformational, and especially in the investing space. I mean, obviously, from a BD perspective, that's when we would onboard and do hard rights, but we would invest if we just needed syndicated capital to get the company to that data for which we would like to see the BD or the M&A. I think we're very interested in all spaces. One of the hot spaces, just in general, not just for J&J, is immunology and inflammation. It's sort of like the new immune they're saying, and especially orals that are safe. And I think so that's a very, very exciting space. Obviously, Alzheimer's and neurodegeneration is an area that we're very, very interested in. And a lot of folks see that as sort of the new frontier in terms of if we can just crack that nut. And we're seeing glimmers of hope, right, with some of the Alzheimer's drugs that have been approved. So those and also obviously, I would call it the renaissance of things like ADCs, which of course have been around for decades, the Seattle genetics, et cetera, but to actually see them being, really successfully, brought to the market is something very exciting. And then of course, radioconjugates, which in the olden days was like the iodines and the lead rooms and things like that. It's really now the alpha emitters that are really people are very excited about. And because both the ADCs and the alpha emitters are things that are clearly, once they get to the cell, going to kill them, as long as they're safe, is something that is pretty sure to be cytotoxic to tumor cells. The immune-onc story has been really interesting, but it's a little squishier because your immune system has to do all those things. And a lot of that hasn't necessarily translated from animal studies into the clinic. So those are some of the things I think that really excite us.
Brad, anything to add to this? What are you looking at and excited about now?
I think so. Within our model, we tend to be therapeutic area agnostic and indication agnostic. I mean, we do see a lot of areas that are becoming very crowded, and it's hard to figure out what the long-term differentiation and sustainable competitive advantage, like should a program get to market, is going to be. So we are spending more time in, rare and orphan diseases where there's a much more defined patient population, clear unmet need, et cetera. I think our guiding light is, try to find swim lanes where there's a lot less thrashing in the pool, because that's a better place for us to look at, right? It dovetails with the capital efficiency, the higher probability of success, the longer sustainability in the market. But overall, we'll look across therapeutic areas.
Dennis, looks like you had something.
I guess from a 30,000-foot area, what we're here for is to help people live longer and live happier.
Yeah.
So that takes me to the longevity space, which is new, but becoming really important, and takes me to mental health, which is a huge unmet need, and I'm particularly interested in what's happening in the psychedelic space right now. We're going to start to see that some psychedelics get approved pretty soon. So we're learning more and more about longevity and what's affecting that, and there's more and more money being poured into that space. We'll see where that goes. And I think on the mental health side, we're seeing results using MDMA or psilocybin or whatever in mental health, in depression or PTSD, that are showing incredible results. So those are two areas that I think that the industry that I'm interested in anyway going forward.
Well, J&J really broke that space open. Nice to see Dr. Husseini Manji win major award for development of Spravato recently.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So I think we're coming to the end of our time in conversations. I really want to talk a little bit about prognosticating in the future. Gabe, we're coming into JP Morgan. Is momentum starting to pick up? Are you excited about what we're going to see there? It's about, 6 weeks or 5 weeks away now. Talk to us about that.
Yes. Yeah. So we do believe that 24 is going to be a busy year. I'm not suggesting that I have a crystal ball and that the markets are going to turn immediately, but to Dennis's point, sentiment has been at an all-time low, and I think it can only go up from here. That, as I mentioned, when I see new funds being raised by OrbiMed and others, right, $billion funds being raised for healthcare and biotech, big balance sheets at pharma and even emerging or mid-cap biotech companies. That just means that there's going to be more deal making, more capital infused into the sector, and there are great companies. There are very seasoned executives running these companies, and we're optimistic about 24. And I do think with a little bit of help from the Fed, we'll catch some wind in our sail. So we think the IPO market will be tested again post the JP Morgan conference. We have a number of companies that are lined up to flip public and hopefully try to go out. And the follow-on activity has always been busy. I mean, public companies need to raise capital, and we'll continue to see, I think, a steady drumbeat of M&A. So all of those things are going to make 24 a productive year.
Exciting. Marian, what are your thoughts on next year?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think already the crossovers are come back to life, which I think is really a positive thing. You see them much more active in financings, and there's a lot of dry capital out there that really has to be deployed. And I think they've been looking just for the right opportunity. So super excited about the recovery with those barometers.
Brad, can I turn it to you?
Surely. Well, we've been busier than ever all through 2023, and I don't expect 2024 to be any different. Again, as the capital situation for a lot of companies has changed, non-dilutive financing is more important than ever. So I think that trend is going to continue. It will be nice to see some resemblance of healthy markets starting to begin again in biotech. And I think as the macro easing happens, biotech, will be the beneficiary of that, whether that's in the second half of the year or the first half of the year. I think it's probably more towards the second half personally. But the reality is there's great science out there. And as Dennis aptly pointed out, we're all in this at the end of the day to help patients.
Indeed. Dennis, closing thoughts.
Yeah, I think in 24 we're going to see kind of the shakeout of the venture and the hedge fund community. We haven't seen that yet, and that's going to be healthy for the sector to get that back to equilibrium. And number one, and number two, Deloitte just put out a report that said the return on R&D at big pharma is 0 right now. So that we have to see pharma start to come at the industry. So. And we started this with saying we're closer to the end than the beginning. So whether it's 24 or 25, who knows?
Oh, well, 24, Dennis, 24.
I think we've heard a lot of optimism here today. I'm really excited about that. Hoping to see everybody at Biotech Showcase around JPM week. I will certainly be there. Sarah, I'll turn it back to you for Q&A, but thank you to Gabe, Brad, Dennis, Marian. Excellent, really informative conversation.
Don't go anywhere, anybody. We have questions. So thank you. Thank you for leading a really great discussion, Virginia. So one of our first questions is relates back to the upcoming presidential election. How many months in advance of November 2024 does the panel think that the US presidential election will start having a significant effect on the life sciences investment decision making, if at all? Okay, Gabe, you're up first.
We generally don't believe it's going to have a meaningful impact on investor sentiment. If you look back historically,
regardless of which party is in the office, it hasn't had a meaningful impact. So while it will be messy and probably ugly, I don't think it's going to get in the way of good companies raising capital and doing BD and M&A.
And same thing, I think in the private, I don't think for privates it'll make a difference.
Okay, Dennis.
We're already seeing headwinds coming out of Washington, no matter who's in charge. You got the IRA, you got the FTC, which is an issue. You got the SEC with some crazy new proposals coming out. So there are some headwinds already. So I don't think the election is going to matter that much. We're kind of fighting a battle in Washington right now.
Okay.
We can still invest in Europe.
That's
their pricing proposals are even more draconian than the US, so I don't know.
We do our CEO summits, and many of the European CEOs want to come to the US. That's their intention for both fundraising and for market. So Brad, do you want to add anything to that, or?
I think a lot of the pessimism is baked into the sector already. So I think there are bigger overhangs at the moment for the sector than what's going to happen in the election. And most of the work in Washington is already been put out there, as Dennis mentioned.
Right, and just a follow-on question to that. One of our other questions that came in is, with the downturn in the market, it was mentioned that we might see less innovation in 2 to 3 years. And we're also looking at the impact of the IRA and how that can hinder innovation. Can you comment on this perfect storm? How will it impact innovation, do you think?
I don't think the IRA is impacting early innovation. That's just my opinion, because I think the notion that we wouldn't develop small molecules for serious diseases because of the IRA I don't think is happening. I think the concept of not having seed funding, that's a whole different story. And so hopefully, maybe that will create a need for funds that will start specializing in smaller startups and seed investing. So stay tuned, I would say.
Okay, yeah. Dennis, do you want to comment on that? Because I think the IRA may be the tip of the iceberg of all the potential hurdles.
Yeah, going back to what Marian said, I think that we're not doing ourselves any favors by saying innovation is just going to go away, because nobody believes that in Washington. And that's not a winning argument, I think, because there's no evidence that development of small molecules is stopping at all. I don't think we're going to see a slowdown in innovation. Too much money out there, and we're in this loop a little bit where we're spending more on healthcare and drugs and enabling people to live longer. And as people live longer, they need more healthcare, so they need more drugs. So we're in this circle where I don't see innovation stopping or slowing.
Yeah, we've been, I think the industry, the sector has been saying, yes, if you try to regulate us, regulate pricing, innovation will go away for years.
And nobody believes it. Or in Washington, nobody believes that.
Okay.
We
Thank you.
We need a better story.
Yes, like a long PR campaign to turn sentiment around a bit, if you will. So Brad, Gabe, do you want to add anything to that?
I would agree. I mean, we're seeing the IRA, or that, future effects of the IRA creeping into M&A discussions as it relates to, the terminal value in a DCF, and it's creeping into fairness opinions. But I don't think it's stopping investments in certain areas. I really don't. And I've heard, kind of anecdotally that certain investors, VCs, are focused on like 505(b)(2) candidates and others. So there's been a little bit of a shift perhaps towards spec pharma because of that, but I think it's on the margin.
Okay. Brad?
I agree. I think it's an incremental shift rather than a wholesale shift. I think folks are more attuned to it in all situations, whether it be investing, advising, or acquiring. But it's not something that's seismic.
Okay. Here is kind of an outlier question. This writer writes that we've seen a lot of organizations and athletes and teams raise money for charities and foundations for cancer research. His question is, or her question is, how much of this money do you think really makes it into the charities and to innovative research? Anyone want to take that?
I think it depends on the charity. It's a sort of a do your diligence question.
Okay. That makes sense.
But I would say the role of the patient advocacy groups is getting stronger and stronger, and becoming more and more important.
They've been partners in, for a lot of medical research, innovative research for years, Dennis, and you're right. They've only been becoming more active.
Okay. I think we're certainly, there's a place for it. I don't know, specifically to the question about, athletes raising questions or raising.
I think that was just an example
on a blanket, but the foundations do have a role. I mean, and that, as Marian had pointed out earlier about non-dilutive financing through grants, that's one path forward. Especially the rare disease communities seem to have a very active role. I mean, we've seen great success out of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, certainly. I mean, we've experienced recently in work that we've done around Niemann-Pick type C, like very strong advocacy, and, every bit helps, both whether it's, capital or time and commitment. There is nothing stronger than the parents' voice in some of these communities.
Right, and they also present the patient point of view. So they bring that to the table.
But the point is well made that a decent percentage of it could go to overhead and operational costs and people's salaries, and not to the research itself. So that's what I meant about the diligence, and there might be ways to find out how much goes to research versus overhead.
Okay, so Marian, one questioner said that, asked a question, he said that you mentioned with the scars, that CEOs with scars are more realistic in their expectations and potentially more successful during a market downturn. Is there some key advice you can give first-time founders, or suggest some resources we should access, to get the veterans' point of views on their strategies.
Yeah, I would say totally network, become friends, and like with other CEOs. There's also a CEO forum that Jody Morrison runs that is.
And we run CEO summits.
And CEO summits, exactly.
Yes.
But at those summits, it don't just, I mean, go to the summits, but also forge relationships that are lasting beyond that. And so therefore you can learn through those folks' experiences, because I believe that we need to continue to invest in first-time CEOs. I mean, I'm a first-time investor in this downturn. I'm like turning to my veteran VC buddies, like, what did you do? Right. So I think this notion of making sure that you have these go-to people on a real-time basis to ask those questions is really important. So your network is going to be important.
Right. Couldn't agree more. Anybody else want to jump in and comment?
I think there might be a disconnect between what founders think are really key inflection points and what investors might consider key inflection points. I mean, it used to be if we got the proof of concept, you kind of called that a win. And now then it got to be, you know, getting in the clinic was a win, and then getting phase 3 was a win. And I think, you know, one of the things we didn't talk about today, we don't have time, I guess, is the whole payer situation. You know, now the payers are in charge, if you will.
Right.
The world has kind of changed in terms of what inflection points are and what matters, and the payers have now become center stage, particularly when they, you know.
I was just going to say, I remember,
Sarah, a whole hour to dig into that space.
Yeah, we don't have time.
Yeah, and I remember when, at Bio, when I was at Bio, all of those inflection points became a point of celebration, and they kept moving up further and further down the road as we went on. So, Brad, you mentioned alternative. Go ahead.
Just one thing on that one is the School of Hard Knocks is an incredibly important degree to have. And that, I think that what I've seen with first-time founders versus experienced management teams, being able to see around the next corner is incredibly important. How to, work with your board in a productive way, how to realize that like the experienced teams in this market have generally known what 12 months from 12 months ago was going to look like, and are starting to have the conversations around, valuations and capital needs and what they should be doing. Whereas some of the less experienced management teams are being caught flat-footed in this type of market. So I think that's where I see the difference. And the advice there is, be a sponge. As a first-time CEO, be a sponge, talk to people who have been there, done that, gone through the cycles, have the war stories, etc.
Okay, thank you, Brad. But a question for you, Brad. You mentioned alternative financing. How early can a company use royalty financing as a way to extend runway and progress their pipeline? Is it phase 1 or even promising preclinical?
Yeah, so the answer to that is it depends. I wish there was a clear answer for that. Generally, if there's, for royalty financing like we do, we depend on a high quality partner on the other end who it's meaningful for. The other things that we've talked about, where it's like trial financing or synthetic royalties, for example, generally depend on visibility into being able to take the program to market or find an eventual partner for it. So there is a time where royalty financing is too early, but there are situations where it makes sense. We will look as early as, phase 1 we'll do. If there's multiple partnerships, look at some things in preclinical as well, but that's part of a bigger financing strategy.
Okay, great. Thank you.
But you can see how royalties have evolved. It used to be that, you couldn't do a royalty financing unless you had a product on the market. Not that long ago.
Okay, thank you both. We have a question for Gabe. You mentioned that diligence will be more tough now that the ecosystem has slowed down. Are there any tips that you can give companies for preparing for and looking great during due diligence?
I don't know
a masterclass, Gabe.
Yeah, no, I don't know that the diligence was ever diligence that investors were doing was ever not tough, right? I mean, I think most of these VCs and public funds have an army of MD PhDs, and they dig in and they go deep. I think perhaps what I said was that, you know, when markets are more frothy, public companies are able to do public deals in a day, sometimes overnight. And that, you know, for certain companies, these deals are taking longer to come together. So I think the diligence, you know, hurdle's always been high. I think, you know, working with great advisors, great lawyers, great accountants, great IR firm, you know, folks that are experienced is the best way to help you prepare for that process. And start early, make sure that, you know, you've kind of done the dry runs, you've got your data room in order, and you're anticipating all these questions that are going to come at you, because it can be incredibly time consuming, right? And you take that over 6 to 12 months, it's a big endeavor. But the hurdle's always been the same.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gabe. And yeah, you're right. It hasn't really changed, has it? Maybe gotten more difficult.
Perhaps, yeah.
So, Dennis, you mentioned a transformation in the chronic disease sector. Will companies in this area be able to get investment with less data?
Yeah, I mean,
What do you think?
it made total sense that we spent a lot of money in oncology and rare diseases because, you know, they were financeable. They get through the FDA sometimes a little bit easier. So I think that's going to be the challenge. That's one of the reasons that we haven't seen, you know, a lot of focus yet on these chronic diseases, because it does take a lot of money. So I think that remains to be seen, but there's just so much money that we haven't tapped into yet, that are not the traditional VC types. You know, we're having this great wealth transfer from baby boomers to the next generation that are interested in biotech. We have the family offices that kind of dwarf the hedge funds. Everybody has ESG mandates, things like that. So it is more costly, but I think there's a lot of money out there if we organize ourselves properly, the industry properly, that's sitting on the sidelines.
Yeah, the question is who's going to lead the organization of the industry to do that?
Well, I mean,
Dennis.
I know how to play musical chairs. I don't know.
Thank you, Dennis. And so I think our last question is for everybody. And the question is, what is the view of you? What is your view on a roll-up strategy to put a number of promising but cash-starved biotech companies in areas that are synergistic together, you know, in one parent company? If you pull them all together, do you think they would be able to attract major funding or the funding that they need to survive?
I've heard efforts at, you know, like PE firms. I don't know if they've come to fruition, but I know that they've, you know, I've heard of those things happening. I think and then of course the devil's in the details, just in terms of doing like multiple transactions and trying to determine what those other companies get in terms of like stock only, et cetera. And then there's, you know, putting teams together. I mean, this has happened in the past where venture firms have done that. But I haven't heard what's come of those. Those are the clinical stage assets. But to be honest, I haven't heard a whole lot of success about those prior efforts. And I'm talking maybe like 5-6 years ago. So I think it's possible, but but I haven't heard that any of those have come to fruition.
So you've heard nothing about companies attempting to do that recently?
No, not like a giant roll up. Almost just like an N of 2, but not yet a giant roll up.
But you are seeing some innovation with these like hub and spoke companies, like a Roivant or a Bridgewater.
Yes.
So they are different models that seem to be working.
Yes. And but again, they're not a roll up so much as Dennis, right? They're like hub and spoke one off. So yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think, you know, there are certainly more private equity companies looking at biotech, but it's later stage, it's revenue generating. They're looking to, kind of roll up some of these
Spec
and
pharma.
yeah, exactly. Spec pharma, grow EBITDA, ultimately find an exit in 4 to 5 years. And I got the impression that your question, Sarah, was around more emerging growth, kind of pre-revenue biotech companies. We're seeing, in the gene therapy space, there are certain investors that recognize that, these companies have kind of fallen out of favor and better to try to aggregate them or consolidate them privately. Last year, there were a couple of large investors that said that, the cell and gene therapy space needs to be rolled up. There need to be fewer of these companies because there's capital expenditure is so significant. We need to benefit from manufacturing and CMC capabilities. We as a firm have tried to do that. We've tried to put, kind of 2 MOE candidates together. It's just very challenging. That's not a roll up, but it's just a very challenging thing to do in the context of pre-revenue biotech companies.
Right. Yeah. The questioner said promising companies in an aligned sector such as oncology. So I would assume that they're all emerging companies that are cash starved.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I think there's ideas that look really good on PowerPoint slides or in Excel models. The human element, it tends to be the piece that screws things up the most. And it's, as I was thinking about the question, I mean, in effect, like with our model, we do a roll up. We roll up economics across different drugs, different classes, different companies. Like we 70 assets with 30 different partners, but we don't have the human element involved, right? The economics don't talk back to you. The economics of a royalty don't have compensation packages or careers they're trying to advance. So I would say for anyone doing a roll-up strategy, make sure the human element works. Like there are some teams that come together where it's a match made in heaven, but be very aware of the cultural components in any type of roll-up.
And I'd say also, if they haven't done a BD deal or financing, then chances are they have what I call a half-baked cake. So in other words, either it's like not quite a DC because we're not sure if we have this or that, or it has some kind of tax liability that hasn't been de-risked. So that's the other problem is if it's coming from a distressed company, it's probably not like ready for prime time.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Marian. So Virginia, I think we're at the end of our time. I'd like to, ask everybody for a final word, and we're at 12:18 now, so we're 3 minutes over.
Well, let me start. We've had a lot of questions about should we go to JP Morgan Week? Should we engage with some
Biotech Showcase Week?
Biotech Showcase Week, as we like to call it. And our answer from a communications perspective is absolutely. I think we've heard, momentum's picking up, and there's a lot of opportunity for networking that I think is going to be really important to success for 2024.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Virginia. Marian.
Oh, definitely go to Biotech Showcase in JP Morgan, because I've seen so many companies. It's like they have the data that we're looking for, and we want to be the first people to see it. And you're not going to do that unless you're like running into people or taking meetings, and you don't want to miss out on something exciting.
Wonderful. Thank you. Dennis.
Yeah, I think maybe we shouldn't lose sight of the big picture here, which is the science is progressing remarkably, and some of the successes over the last year or two have been spectacular. And when we look back on them, we'll see that this was a golden age for R&D in the sector.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dennis. Brad.
You need to keep planting seeds for the future. So, treat 2024 as the beginning of coming out of something. There will be a point where we talk about these last couple of years like we are about 2002 and 2003 and 2016. This too shall pass.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brad. Good advice. Gabe, you have the last word almost.
Yes, no, we've talked a lot about reducing costs and extending runway, but I think the importance of IR and BD can't be overstated. So you need to go to these conferences, you need to be seen, you need to talk to people, tell your story, get your equity story out, make relationships. It is a people business. So that's important. If you're going to cut costs, preserve the IR and BD folks to go out and do what they do best.
Wonderful, thank you. So with that, that's all the time that we have today. Virginia, I do want to thank you for leading a great discussion with a great group of panelists. So Gabe, Brad, Dennis, Marian, thank you so much for the time that you spent with us today. And I'd like to thank all of the viewers who have stayed with us during this time. As I noted earlier, this has been recorded. It will be available for viewing in about 2 to 3 hours on our website. I also want to thank Biotech Digital Partnering and Big 4 Bio for their support. And I'd also like to invite you all to come back to our next virtual salons and to welcome you and to see you at Biotech Showcase during JP Morgan Week. Thank you all.